So last I spoke here, which was a couple of weeks ago, introducing the Sabbath, and it hasn't been exactly the best couple of weeks for us. So we found out our car needed some major repairs. So our radiator and our water pump needed fixing. So that was quite a bit of money. And then our roof started leaking. So that was frustrating. And then a week ago on Friday, I got an email at 7 p.m. Saying that I didn't have a job after June. So and I'm not saying this to complain. What I'm saying is, when I'm coming this morning, and also I got a really bad cold last weekend. So on top of everything else, let's give him a cold. So now he can't talk or sleep. So I'm saying this today as a way of saying that what we're talking about isn't this separate idea or theme or thing that I think about theoretically, or I'm saying, throwing this on you. This is something I'm extremely wrestling with as a way of navigating life, and what does it mean to simply carry on in the face of a lot of uncertainty. And I know a lot of you are dealing with similar or even worse things, and I know the stories of health issues and problems and concerns that are in this church, and we're all coming into these questions, and it's so easy to talk about Christianity and church and God's promises and all this stuff, and is this kind of this ideal way, and then go off and say, how do we deal with this? So I'm being vulnerable here as a way of saying, this is life to me, and I'm wrestling with it. So I'm coming here this morning, not because I necessarily want to and have this great excitement, but because this is where I'm finding life, and this is what's making the difference for me this week. So this is coming out of a place of a lot of depth. And so this last week, as I also had the end of the quarter, so I teach full-time, so end of the quarter, so I had to do a huge amount of grading and a huge amount of responding to students who just realized that assignments were due the last week of the quarter. Shocking, right? At the end of the quarter, there's an assignment due? I know. It's I only wrote it 8 different places in the syllabus, and so I had all this busyness and flood, and now I'm having to think about what am I going to do after June. So now I have everything how do I navigate this? Who do I need to talk to? How do I need to respond? And all this stuff was flooding. In the meantime, I'm having to sit down and say I have to write a sermon and come to terms with what it means to have a Sabbath. And yesterday morning hit, and I said, I'm just going to stop, because when it comes to doing a sermon on the Sabbath, talking about the Sabbath, there's a certain amount of work you have to do, an amount of effort you have to pour into writing a sermon. But the problem with writing a sermon on the Sabbath is, am I going to come and then talk about the Sabbath in a theoretical way, having worked 7 days or 10 days straight? And so I'm setting expectations here. So I can't guarantee this sermon is going to be very good, is what I'm saying, but it's going to have integrity. So that should be worth something, because yesterday I didn't do anything. I said, I'm done. So this is a sermon with integrity, and that can maybe give you some grace in what happens next. Set expectations, and then if you end up doing good, it's everyone. Yeah, you know the secrets. So 2 weeks ago when I started, I asked 4 questions about ways of thinking about the Sabbath, and as we go through talking about what it means to wrestle with the way the Sabbath is portrayed in Scripture. And I even handed out some papers, and you got some verses that way. There's a lot of different things going on with the Sabbath. It's not a small thing in Scripture. It's a calling, it's a law, it's a rule, but that also means there are people doing it wrong and not getting it. And so there's, from beginning to the end, there's this theme of Sabbath, because God himself took a break on the 7th day and says, take a break. And that's important. So the 4 questions are, what is Sabbath? If we're going through this series, we're talking about what is a Sabbath, just basically. Is the Sabbath important? It's kind of a rhetorical question, because if we're going to have a sermon series on it, you think, okay, yeah, we think we've answered that. But there's also, in the New Testament, we have passage where it says, don't worry about these things. Don't worry about the rules and the laws. And so we have to come back to say, is this something important for us as Christians to take seriously? So that leads us to our third question. What are we called to do? In light of the Sabbath, what are we called to do? And the fourth question is, what will we do? So it's not just a calling, like, oh, here's this idea that we should do these things. It's the wake up on a Saturday morning and say, I need to stop, even though I don't have time and I'm going to stand up in front of a bunch of people and talk anyhow. First comes saying, I have to take a Sabbath. So we're going to go through some passages in Luke. The ushers have some Bibles. If you need one, raise your hand. It's on page 1032 of the blue Bibles. So I got them by surprise. I know, I'm sorry. If you need a Bible, just raise your hand and they'll come around. So this week the theme is the Sabbath is for others. We always think about Sabbath as we tend to do about what it means for us. If we're especially Christian or holy, we think, what does the Sabbath mean about God? But really we tend to think, what does the Sabbath mean for us? How can I stop? How can I take a break? But when we read through Scripture, we see all throughout that the Sabbath isn't about us at all. It's not just about us stopping and resting and getting a break while the rest of the world goes on. The Sabbath is a bigger deal than that. It involves us stopping. It involves us resting, but there's more to it. And if we don't understand how the Sabbath is for others too, we can actually live out the Sabbath in a wrong way and put demands on other people and to put demands on the world that ends up undermining our very message. So Luke 6, starting with verse 1 through 11. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and his disciples began to pick some heads of grain, rub them in their hands, and eat the kernels. Some of the Pharisees asked, "Why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" Jesus answered them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and taking the consecrated bread, he ate what is lawful only for priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. And then Jesus said to them, the Son of Man," speaking of himself, "is the Lord of the Sabbath." The Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. Who's in charge of the Sabbath? The Lord. Who's the Lord? Jesus, yeah, Son of Man. He uses a lot of different titles for himself. He's saying, I'm in charge of what happens and what doesn't happen, and I say, we can eat. We can pick grains. According to the law, it was okay for people to go through fields and pick the extra grains as a way of feeding. And farmers were said to leave some. And so he was taking advantage of what this rule was, which is to say, if you're hungry, here's some things to eat. We're not restricting it. We continue. On another Sabbath, he went into the synagogue and was teaching, and a man was there whose right hand was shriveled. The Pharisees and the teachers of the law were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus. So they watched him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. But Jesus knew what they were thinking, and he said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Get up and stand in front of everyone." So the man got up and stood. Then Jesus said to them, I ask you, which is lawful on the Sabbath? To do good or to do evil? Sometimes we're locked in that choice. Do you do good or do you do evil? To save life or to destroy it? And by not saving a life, you're not absolved of a life that dies because you didn't save it. Just by not doing something, sometimes we let evil happen. So what are we called to do on the Sabbath? He looked around at them all and then said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He did so. And his hand was completely restored. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law were furious and began to discuss with one another what they might do to Jesus. So we come back to these questions. What is the Sabbath? What's that? Day of rest. What is rest? I'll dig into that answer a little bit. What does it mean to rest? To refresh yourself, to relax, to stop. Can we rest if other people around us aren't resting? Sometimes, right? We like the idea of saying, no, but who goes on vacation at a hotel, a really nice resort? At a restaurant? I'm going to go and sit back at a restaurant and get away from my kids for a little bit. God love them. Do I rest? But is everyone resting? Is the Sabbath important? Yes. Okay, so we got that one. Yes, we know the answer. If you don't know the answer, it's either Jesus or yes. The Sabbath's important. Jesus, yeah, that's close enough. He's Lord of the Sabbath. That gets you there. So now what are we called to do? Here's where Jesus throws a wrench into this, because the religious leaders would say the Sabbath is for rest and you stop, and here's a list of all the things you can't do. They would say, because the Sabbath is important, we're doing this. This isn't our rules. This is God. It's important. And then they would say, because of all these lists of things, you can't heal. You can't pick grain. You can't do these things. Jesus says, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath, and I say you can heal. You can feed. You can share. You can absorb. What is rest then? So what is the Sabbath in light of how Jesus twists this? It's not simply about stopping. There's something bigger that happens here. So what are we now called to do? In light of that bigger picture of rest, in light of that communal expression of rest, how are we called to live out the Sabbath? It's not just about us. So why the Sabbath? We talked about this in the last couple of weeks. We take a Sabbath rest to acknowledge that God is God. And so when I took a Sabbath rest yesterday, I didn't do so because I was exhausted or tired. I was. And I didn't do so that I could come here and brag about how I did this thing. I did it because I was really struggling to see how God was going to bring an answer to some problems that don't seem to have answers. And I was really struggling to have a sense of how God is going to work stuff out. And I realized this was a crisis of faith. I didn't believe God's promise. And so rather than me working and doing and writing this email and that email and trying to secure things in that way, I listened and I said, I'm going to stop, because at the end of the day, I am not God. You're all relieved to hear that. I'm not God of my life. You're not God of your life. How do we acknowledge that? It's all nice and good to come here and thank you for coming and show up and spend some time. But then how do we live the rest of our week? Do we act like if we don't get something done that nothing's going to happen, that God's going to forsake us? Do we act like that? If something goes wrong, do we say God hates us or life is going to turn to this horrible direction? Then we're trying to be God of our own life. So how do we stop being God of our own life? We let it go. And we take one day a week and say, you're in charge. If I don't get done the things that I need to get done, God is still in charge. If I don't show up for that thing that I need to show up for, God is still in charge. Do we believe that? Not really. Our society teaches us not to believe that. And so we go through having this half-hearted idea of belief in God, but when it comes down to it, we still, make sure we have all our backups in place. Because what if God doesn't come through? So we're not God of our life, and we stop to say, we're not in God. But that's just about us. When Sabbath is also about others, we do more than simply stop. We do more than simply say, okay, I'm giving up, I'm stopping today, and I let other people take care of me. We also help other people take Sabbath rest. Sabbath is about other people, so part of our Sabbath rest is helping other people take rests. If we help other people take rest rather than demanding more from them, we show that we're not God of them. This is part of the other problem in our world. We think we're God of our own lives, and we also are pretty sure that we're God of other people's lives. And we get really mad when they don't acknowledge it. People should get out of my way when I'm on the freeway because they know where I'm going and are stopping me from getting there. We get furious at them, right? They didn't go at the green light fast enough. So what do? Right? Because we have places to go, and they need to know that. And if they don't know that, we get mad at them. And we say things in our car that they won't hear, but the universe hears it. And the universe will pay them back. That's the dream, right? Somehow we think the universe is going to pay them back. We're not the God of other people. Other people were not created to serve us. Other people were not created to make us feel better about ourselves. Other people were not created to make us feel extra special and of a higher class. Other people were created to love God and love others. We were created to love God and love others. How do we do that in a society where everybody's ranking everyone else based on who can tell other people what to do? The more people you can tell what to do, the better of a person you are in our society. We hear that in every direction. We're not the God of other people, and that's what the Sabbath tells us. And now I think this is why it's a law. As I'm wrestling with why does God institute a law like, yes, rest? Like, that seems like a silly law to give. Like, we should know that already. And like, okay, if I just remember to rest. But he makes it a law. And one reason I think it's a law is it's not to give us more hall monitors so that the people who have power can have more rules and more things to list. And it's not why Jesus made a law for it. It's to get us to do the things that we wouldn't do otherwise. It takes away our ability to have excuses. If it's a law, we won't do it, or we shouldn't do it. And otherwise, we'll come up with 80 other reasons why we should do it, even though it's a good idea. It's also, and this is the big realization I've had about the Sabbath, it's also to keep the people in charge from imposing their will. Because what God says to the people in charge is, you're not God. And he creates this rule that keeps them from imposing their will on other people. That's what the law does. It's kind of like the Bill of Rights. It's not a rule to here's the thing you need to do and the things you need to do. It's a rule to say, people in charge are going to take advantage of you, and I'm going to put this in place to stop them. People in charge will work you to the bone. They will steal your soul. They will eat you up for their own benefit, for their own advantage, and they don't care as long as they get higher. And what God does is says, they're not God. And if they do that, they're wrong. That's the society we're supposed to live in, where even those people who are in charge don't get a say about how we exist. People take advantage of other people. That's the way of this world. People take advantage of other people, and there's a certain amount of pride in being better skilled about taking advantage of other people. That's the message of the world. The better you can take advantage of other people, the better person you are. We hear that a lot. Maybe not in those words, but that's what can we get away with? What can we make someone do for us that they don't even know they're doing, but somehow we've gotten something from them? So the Sabbath asks this other question. How do we protect others around us? If we are people who are living in light of the Sabbath, how do we protect them? How do we become people, instead of taking advantage of them, instead of seeing people as steps to step on to our own advantage, do we say, if God's given me the grace to have some kind of power or control, how can I use that to protect other people so that they're not taken advantage of? This is what Jesus did. Jesus took the weight of the religious leaders and the other leaders' anger on him. He said, I'm going to heal this person's hand. I'm going to heal this person's hunger. And they were mad and angry, and they had the power to affect those people's lives. And Jesus stood in the place and said, you can't touch them because I'm in charge. And then what did they continue to do? They plotted against him. because now he was subverting their ability to control other people. And they crucified him. That's giving away the story a little bit. In a few weeks, you'll find that this turned out seemingly bad. But how did he show that he's Lord? He rose again. He refused to stay dead. The ultimate act against a rebellion about people who think you can control your life is to not be dead. Like, what else are you going to do? This is it. And that's the promise to us. The promise to us is if we are walking with this person, we are covered from his protection. And in being covered by his protection, we can be people who live out that new kind of story in our context, wherever it is. So 4 questions again. Come back to this. What is the Sabbath now? Day of rest. What is rest? Now, there's a bigger answer, right? Is the Sabbath important? Yes. What are we called to do? Protect others. Protect ourselves. Who protects us? Jesus. That's always right. That's the safe. Jesus, yes. Yeah. Unless you're in a Pentecostal church, then it's the Holy Spirit. That's bad joke. Thank you for laughing. So what will we do? So what we're called to do, now this is a question that I can't answer for you. I can answer this for myself. I can say, here are some things we're called to do. Here's why the Sabbath is important. But what does this mean for your life this week about maintaining the Sabbath? For me, this week, it meant stopping yesterday. Not simply because I needed a break, which I sort of did, but also because I realized any anxiety, any panic, any frustration, any of those building emotions that happen when things go wrong could easily be translated into how I respond to my family and how I respond to people who might want to reach out. So rather than giving into that anger and frustration, I said, I'm letting it go. Because the people around me needed peace too. I can't control the circumstances, but I can control the atmosphere of my home. On the Sabbath, Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues. And a woman was there who had been crippled by a spirit for 18 years. She was bent over and could not straighten up at all. When Jesus saw her, he called her forward and said, "Woman, you are set free from your infirmity." And he put his hands on her, and immediately she straightened up. Indignant because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, the synagogue leader said to the people, "There are 6 days for work, so come and be healed on those days, not on the Sabbath." The Lord answered him, "You hypocrites!" Now there's a guy who's protecting, right? "Doesn't each of you on the Sabbath untie your ox or donkey from the stall and lead it out to give water? Then should not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has kept bound for 18 long years, be set free on the Sabbath day from what bound her?" When he said this, all his opponents were humiliated. But the people, they were delighted with the wonderful things he was doing. Who was Jesus' audience? The people. Don't be an opponent of Jesus. Can you write that down? It's a good lesson. So why were the religious leaders mad? They were mad because Jesus didn't follow the rules. They had a way of answering the question, why is the Sabbath important? What are we called to do? And they said, this is how it is and this is how it should be, and everyone needs to fit in this rules. Jesus didn't follow the rules. Jesus recognized real situations. Jesus didn't encounter people as objects that have to fit into certain categories in order to have the machinery functioning right. And that's how a lot of our society was then and is now. Everyone fits in their slots, and as long as you're doing your slot right, you're fine, but get out of that slot, you've made up the whole mess, and we need to fix you. He recognized real situations. So what does the Sabbath mean for us? It means, what is the real situation we're living in? What does it mean to have rest in your life? What does it mean to help other people have rest in your life? It's not a set of rules. It's a living expression of love that God has for us and that we are called to have for other people. Because we live in a world of transactions. We don't live in a world where we're interacting with people as people. We like the idea of saying, oh, there's people, we meet people all the time, but we don't. When we go to the bank, we're not talking to the person on the other side as if they're a real person. We're talking to them as if they're the person who can help our request dealing with our money. To us, we're not a real person. We're a person that has an account number. If we didn't have an account number, they would not give us money. I've tried that. It does, not in a mean sense. That could be interpreted in a lot of bad ways. I handed them a note. No, that was not what I did. We don't talk to people. Everywhere we go, we don't talk to people. We talk to whatever we're wanting to accomplish. But Jesus always saw real people. The waiter gives us food, we pay. There's this transaction. The waiter isn't serving us because they have this wonderful sense that we're in need of a good meal and they just wanted to volunteer their time to help us, right? Maybe someday, I don't know. I haven't been to that restaurant. The mechanic fixes our car, not out of the goodness of their heart, but because we're giving them a lot of money. We work a job. Most of us don't work for jobs because we say, I'm going to get up this morning and I really have this passion to help this person I know get this job done. And if they pay me, great. If not, good things. No. We work, we get paid, they pay us. What if we don't get paid? We don't work, right? And we write, so we are sure to talk to someone. I didn't get my check this week. We get entertained. We pay for a movie. We go down this list. We go on vacation. All of these are transactions. We have these transactions everywhere we go. Life is about these transactions. Everything becomes about this interaction, not with people as people, but people as this way of getting me what I want. Even churches do this. The pastor preaches a sermon. People listen to the sermon. Transaction. Right? What if the preacher messes up on a verse or a little bit of theology? They'll hear back because it's not about the person, what the pastor's going through that week. It's about whether or not they're fitting into the transaction. What about if it goes both ways? Pastors have a lot of expectation. There's a lot of stuff that happens. I'm sorry if I'm going to. There's a lot of stuff that happens on a Sunday morning, and it's very easy for pastors to take advantage of the people who volunteer because we need things to happen. Yet oftentimes, those are people who are working nonstop. But because things need to happen, we burn people out all the time. But things need to get done. It's a transaction. Sabbath is not about transactions. Sabbath is about recognition. Jesus recognizes each person. He calls them by name. He reaches into their lives and says, what is it that will give you rest? God recognizes us. And God says to you, rest. It's okay. He says to you, rest. It's okay. Rest. Rest. Take a day off. It's okay. And he knows what you're dealing with. It's not like God saying, well, if God only knew what I'm dealing with. He knows. And it's hard because we're not in a society that makes it easy. We're not in a culture that creates zones of protection so that those of us who have too much to do can just take a day off. I'm not making this, say this is just an easy thing to just stop one day. Many of us are in situations where we can't do that because our schedule is not our own. So how can we as a community recognize each other and give us rest, give each other rest? That's now taking this transaction stuff we're doing as a church and making it into a living recognition of each other. There are some people who are volunteering who haven't stopped for weeks but know things need to get done and are willing to do it. Those of you who have time during the week to take off, step in on a Sunday. Help someone who doesn't have a day off, take a day off. If we're all participating together, if we're all contributing together, then now we have this mutuality. We have this celebration together because we're now real people to each other. We recognize other people. Do we recognize other people around us? Everywhere you go, do we recognize people as a living person who God loves? You start doing that, it's not this big, dramatic, like huge transition, but now you're interacting with people in a lot of different ways than you were before. Grace starts abounding if you realize maybe the waiter didn't serve you nice because they're this horrible person, so to deliver bad tip, maybe they have this huge problem at home that is causing them to be very distracted. How can you give someone, even if they owe you something, how can we give them rest? You can go down the list on that, and the list is endless because we're always encountering people every day who are above us or below us, and they're called to have Sabbath too. How can we be people who create the context of Sabbath? So some themes to think about this week. 1, Sabbath is for rest. Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. He said so. We're not lords of other people. Lords get a Sabbath by making other people work. If we're making other people work to give us rest, what are we saying about ourselves? Who's Lord of the Sabbath? Jesus. The Sabbath isn't a spa then. It's not a vacation. It's not just this whatever I want to do just to make myself feel better, and if people can feed into that, then great. The Sabbath is a rest, and it's a reminder. And it's a testimony. Because the rest of the world doesn't get why we would take a day off, because it doesn't get that God is Lord. So you have to do the things you have to do to get things done. They don't believe the fact that God is in charge. And if we don't believe that either, what kind of testimony are we giving? Sabbath is a testimony. It's a way of saying, I trust God. That's also a way of taking a good nap, so win-win. So, but what about those who can't rest? There are people in this world, and the passage, there are people whose illnesses, whose work situations, who have all these things going on, who can't rest. We help them rest. That's our calling. As followers of the Lord of the Sabbath, we become people who say, how can I help you rest? If that means taking on a little bit extra stuff during the week, not on the Sabbath, during the week, we do that. We help them rest. If someone's going nonstop, we don't add more to their plate. We say, you're doing enough. How can I bless you in what you're doing? So how do we do this as a community? So to help this isn't just a general rule. What does this mean for the River Church? And I think there's a lot of churches out there, and this isn't a criticism because I think this is just how things have been done. There's a lot of things happening in churches where it's just so nonstop, do this, do this. The more we do, the more people we get in, the more programs we have, the more money we get. It's exhausting. So pastors burn out at an extremely high rate because they're being asked to do so much, and there's never a point at which it's enough. And people leave churches because there's never a point enough. The only way they can find sense of rest is by going somewhere else. And then it starts over again. So we have these people going to different churches, pastors burning out. It's not supposed to be like this. We're called to be people of rest who help others rest, who have a testimony of rest to the world. So what does that mean for us? And that's not an answer I can give. It's not an answer Chris can give or Seth can give or anyone. It's an answer that we all have to say, what is my role here in saying, what can we do to help others rest? Because we're in this together. Whatever happens in Natomas, whatever happens in each other's lives, we have been called together to be part of this body. And God never says it's up to you to fix it on your own. The Christian life is too hard to do on your own. We have been called together to help support each other as a way of providing space so that we can rest, so that we can contribute. So Sabbath is for rest. We have to be people who make space for others to take a Sabbath. We are called to be faithful to this. That means things are going to get left undone. And that means things are going to get messed up and not be very good sometimes. We're called to be faithful, not called to be perfect. And sometimes being faithful is the way of hope, and being perfect is the way of sin. And that's not the message that we hear from the world. Second, the Sabbath is for healing. Thinking of the Sabbath as rest sort of makes it feel like it's, okay, that can just be about me. And I can shape it so it's about others. When Sabbath is about healing, that means there's some kind of community involved. There's other people who need healing, and there's people who can provide healing. What kind of healing needs to take place in the lives of those you know? Think about that. Think about the people you know. Where do they need healing? We all have our places that we need healing. We all have our brokenness. We all have our issues. We all have our ways in which things just aren't working the way they should. And we also all have our ways in which we can contribute to the lives of others. We all have our brokenness, and we all have our contribution. How can we be people who work together so that where I'm broken, someone else can step in? But where someone else is broken, I can step in. And now, suddenly, we're not just these separate individuals going off doing our own thing. We're actually people who are creating a context of rest and hope and healing. And that's good news. We're a society that's consumed with anxiety, with stress, with worry, with bitterness, or as Paul writes in Galatians, hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions, and envy. And that's just on Facebook this morning. We need healing from this. Because the world isn't going to give us healing from it. It's going to make it worse. It's going to take that wound and poke a finger in it. The world wants hatred. The world wants discord. The world wants fits of rage because you can profit off that. If someone is caught in envy and ambition, I can take advantage of them for my own ends. We need healing from all this. We need rest. And we need to stop. How do we stop? The world won't give us space. So we just stop. We just say, I'm not doing that. Because if we stop, other people can stop. Jesus stopped and said, I'm going to take the brunt of this anger and heal this person. And by healing that person, they were able to rest. There is the Sabbath. Sometimes we need to be the people who stop so the people around us can stop. And if we stop, if we actually live in this moment, we start recognizing people as people. Oh, now I'm seeing faces and names and stories, and I'm making space for conversations. And now suddenly we're real people to each other. And once we're real people with each other, we start realizing how we all need healing. And once we realize how we can need healing, we start saying, oh, I can step in there. But if we're all going busy nonstop, we don't listen and we don't recognize. Sabbath is third for peace. Paul continues in Galatians 5. The way of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. There's no law against these. That's what's called the fruit of the Spirit. And there's a lot of psychological study behind each of these that's very interesting. When you're in a relationship where you're trusting, you're able to relax in a way that you can't in any other situation. We're always on edge. We're always tense. We're always anxious. But if you're actually with someone who you really trust, there's a massive physiological thing that happens that you rest. So we become those kind of people for each other. We become people who love. We become people who show joy. We become people who create atmospheres of peace. Because people need peace. And where are you going to go in this world just to rest and have a sense of peace? It's not religious control. It's not about here's the rules and here's the that you have to do this in order to please God. It's this invitation and saying God wants something bigger for us. We're not this religious people who say we want to control other people's lives so that we can get them to do what we want so that we can have a sense of power. We're saying God made this world. And he made this world to function in a certain way, and this is an invitation to a kind of life that's bigger than the other people can imagine. Everyone's striving for meaning. Everyone's striving for purpose and identity and something that they don't even know what they're striving for. And they think they found this little bit of it and they want to hold on to it because that's all they can see. And God is saying, I made the whole world. Here it is. It's a life of work, but it's also a life of rest. That's how creation was made. It's a rhythm of life. It's a rhythm of life for us. It's a rhythm of life for others, that if we live into this rhythm, we start seeing life more than we ever imagined. There's more to this life. Because peace isn't just for us. It's not about us securing our own little territory so that all the wars and all the other stuff can happen around. Because if there's stuff happening, if there's busyness, you don't really stop. You're always having to fight for your little bit of peace. And that's what Rome did. So when at the time of this was writing, Rome was the biggest empire of the world and was always having these wars and battles. And so there were soldiers and there were barbarians and there were these constant wars that were happening in order to create this little bit of peace for the Roman citizens. But it was chaos. This peace that Rome had was a peace that was paid for by others. And if our peace is being paid for by others, if our rest is being paid for by others, it's not the rest that God is offering us. The peace, this invitation, this bigger life that God is saying isn't just for us. It's this invitation to this world. It's a peace that we all have together. It's saying, I'm giving you all peace. He's saying to Thomas, I have this offer for peace. There's a different way of living this life. And it's not that someone has to pay for this peace. This is a peace paid for by Christ. Peace is for all of us together, paid for by Christ. And if we live in this peace, we have this new kind of possibility, this invitation, this hope, and this rest. God's inviting us into this big life, this life that goes beyond what we can possibly imagine or expect because the world doesn't get it. This big life that says, all of you rest. There's not a certain category of people that have to do all the work while we get the rest. Everyone gets to rest. And things still get done. It's this big life because we learn how to live this full life in a way that's bringing out other people's fullness. It's an inviting life. The world can't promise that. It needs other people to pay the penalty for our own successes. While Jesus is saying, there's something bigger. There's something better. But it starts with rest. And that's what the Sabbath is saying. Are we people who are going to compete the way the world competes and live according to the way the world lives? Or are we going to trust? And it's not easy because things need to get done, right? And I'm saying this as like, I need a job in July, and there's a lot of tension in me trying to do something for that. But I also know that my hope is not in the world, it's in God. And God can awaken possibilities. Jesus was dead for 3 days. It's way too late to do anything after that. And what happened? He rose again. I'm going to give you away the story. He rose again. There's never too late if we trust that God is God and wait with God's waiting. So this community that becomes a community of expectation is now a community of possibilities. What is possible if we actually work together? We help each other. We come alongside and say, how can we help each other rest? Not what can you do for me, but how can I help you rest? So that's the challenge this week. Because it's not is Sabbath important? What is a Sabbath? Or what should we do? It's what are we actually going to do? So how can you help someone rest this week? That's my invitation. That's my challenge. Think of someone specific. And it doesn't have to be now you're going to change the world. It doesn't start with that because that's not what God calls us to do. There's a lot of us. And if we're all doing this, now the world is different. It's not one. Jesus was the one person who changes the world. We're just all parts of a system, a mission that God is putting together. And if we each do our own part, suddenly there's music playing in all these different places, in your work, in your home, and people start hearing that music and seeing that there's something different. So that's the invitation. Rest and help someone rest this week. So let's pray. Dear God, thank you for your goodness. Thank you that you are a God who invites us into a bigger life, a better way of living. And it's not about us doing more work or panicking or getting caught in anxiety and always worrying if we're doing enough or being enough, but that you say, stop. May we hear you this week. May we trust you this week. May, even if we can't stop this week, may we find ways of getting to the point where we can. And it's a journey for some of us. I don't know how to not do the things I need to do, but I know you're calling me to that. So may I have wisdom on how to live this out. And may each person here have wisdom to know which direction to go, to be people of rest, of peace, of healing. May we see each other as real people. And may we see you evermore. In your name we pray.